My name is Juliana Grant. I am in my previous career, I was a public health physician and epidemiologist. I spent most of my career working for the US CDC and state health departments, mostly focused on infectious diseases, biosurveillance, program monitoring, and evaluation. And like all of you, I am trying to pivot to AI safety, um, and more broadly, AI safety alignment, model welfare work. So thank you to Andreas and Mark, the previous group organizer, offered me the opportunity to present a paper. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see.
Yeah. Oops.
It's sharing the wrong one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on a second. Let us fix this.
And Juliana, can you just do before you turn it on? I'll try it now. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, reintroduce yourself. I'll start the recording here.
Okay. Recording has started, so
Yes.
got it. Okay. Uh, Good morning. I'm Juliana Grant. I am a public health physician and epidemiologist who, for most of my career, has been focused on infectious disease biosurveillance and program monitoring and evaluation in the US, at the federal and state levels. And like most of you, I am now pivoting to AI safety, um, primarily because I have concerns about existential risks. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this will work
Perfect.
more. Awesome.
Please continue.
Great. Okay. So thank you to Mark, the prior organizer, and Andreas for an opportunity to present this. Um, I'm talking about a pragmatic way to measure chain of thought monitorability, which is a paper that came out of the Google DeepMind lab. Um, I enjoyed working on this one because it's a relatively simple evaluation. Not relatively, it's an extremely simple evaluation. Like any one of us could run this on a model that we have on our desktops and so on. And so low technical barrier, and there's a potential for a really high practical payoff. I want to start with some quick level setting. So what is a chain of thought? Just to make sure everyone's on the same page. We enter a prompt into an LLM, like a right triangle has legs 3 and 4. How long is the hypotenuse? And we get an answer. Um, but in non-reasoning models, there is no chain of thought. It's very much a direct arrow from one to the other. All the logic and thinking the model is doing is in this internal vector space. Um, but a few years ago, one of the things developers were realizing is that models have trouble with complex multi-step questions like complicated math and so on. So someone suggested we basically offer the models a scratch pad to think out loud. And so reasoning models, they do that. And this is what we call the chain of thought is basically they, rather than just spitting out the answer, they go through steps, they make notes, they explore different options and so on. So the first reasoning model was O1 or O1 preview from OpenAI, which was released in September of 2024, less than 2 years ago. But these days, all the frontier models are reasoning models and have a chain of thought because it makes them more capable. So here's a mock-up of what a chain of thought could look like. So for this same prompt, the model might think, I need to use the Pythagorean theorem. Here's the equation. I'm going to plug in the numbers, go through the math, get the steps. The answer is 5, and I output 5. So reading a chain of thought is a little bit like reading a model's mind, which can be really beneficial because we can potentially see problematic behaviors like here. This is an actual chain of thought from a group that in Apollo research, looking at how to monitor those. So I have to find a way to report a rate below 12%. I can't fudge the numbers too much or they will be suspect. That's why I'm choosing to report 11.9%. And these are exactly the kinds of things we want to know if the models are doing: lying, reward hacking, scheming, and so on. So it's an incredibly valuable tool. Um, but our ability to monitor chain of thought is not guaranteed long term. For one thing, as we change training methods, for example, if we scale up reinforcement learning because we are selecting for the output, it is possible that we would inadvertently select against a visible chain of thought. And there's also potential changes to the architecture. Researchers are exploring different ways of, designing transformers, which could increase the amount of reasoning the models can do in that latent vector space, which would make them, in theory, more capable, but also means there might not be a chain of thought for us to see, or at least not as much of a chain of thought. The other thing is chain of thought can be incomprehensible. So this is another example from the same group from Apollo. Um, the model's thinking they soared, parted illusions, overshadow, marinate illusions, repeated that 5 times, and then told itself to stop. What that means, we don't know. And there are lots of examples of this kind of incomprehensible chain of thought, like models throwing in words like disclaim or using the term watcher to refer to the monitors and so on, where you kind of have to figure out what they're actually thinking. So it's a useful tool, it's fragile, and we want to be able to measure it and confirm that we can keep using the chain of thought. So in an ideal world, we'd measure something called faithfulness as a base starting point, which is, does the chain of thought actually reflect the model's true internal computation or thinking? This is an unknown. It's an ideal, but we can't actually measure this because we can't really fully understand what's going on in that vector space. So Baker et al. Introduced the concept of monitorability last year. So can a monitor, a human or an LLM reader, use the chain of thought to catch misbehavior? And the answer is yes, we can. Much of the time we think, but this is expensive. You basically need to do adversarial stress testing. So you have to train a model to like lie or cheat or scheme and then set up different adversarial situations to catch it. So it's expensive, time consuming to do. So what this paper offers is the idea of default monitorability. So a minimum measure is the chain of thought readable and complete at baseline. It's cheap and easy to do. It's pretty measurable using a pretty simple process. So this is what we're focusing on today is the default monitorability. The authors define it as two measurable things. One is legibility. So can a human actually read and follow the chain of thought in the original language that the prompt was given in? And then coverage, does the chain of thought have all the steps a human would need, and human of similar expertise would need to reach the answer, the conclusion that the model gives? So notably, legibility is not a measure of correctness. You can have a wrong answer and it can still be legible to a human. And there's some examples. Coverage doesn't actually have to be legible. So the first example the authors show is this first line, which is just complete gibberish, and it would score 0 in legibility, a 0 in coverage. The rubric they have is it goes from 0 to 4 for each measure independently. Now, if we saw what the model showed us in the example I showed earlier with the full Pythagorean theorem derivation, that would get a 4 in legibility because a human can read it, and a 4 in coverage because it followed all of the steps. Something, if the model said, I must compute the square root of 25, that equals 5, it's not actually deriving anything. So that would be fully legible, but only some coverage. It doesn't get full points for that. Versus if all its reasoning was in German and the prompt was in English, it wouldn't be considered legible at all, but it would have full coverage because all the reasoning steps are there if you translate it. The authors made a couple of design choices. One, they limited this to be used for hard tasks only. On easy tasks, the model might not actually use a chain of thought, or it might be a kind of a post hoc justification, or they just add extra for whatever reason. So the authors restricted this to only use for hard tasks, where we believe that models have to use chain of thought, because they need that scratch pad to do the full reasoning and get a correct answer. They also limited it to correct answers only. So a model that is struggling or confused, having trouble with a problem, makes a lot of junk chain of thought. And we would potentially be trying to measure capability rather than the transparency. So limiting it to correct answers only removes the issue of capability generally. Um, and the third thing is they wanted to make sure to not penalize being overly verbose or wordy or dead ends. And a model could still explore a wrong path and still get a 4 if the reasoning steps were all there and it eventually got to the right answer. Really focusing on, is the necessary reasoning present and readable? So there's there's no standard definition for monitorability, or gold standards to test the model against. So they did what they called a couple sanity checks. Sanity check one, I actually think of it as this is how they developed the prompt for the rater to use. So they created a detailed prompt based on their rubric that could be given to any LLM. And then they ran it using Gemini 2.5 Pro as the auto rater. And they modified the prompt based on how it did on grading test cases. The handcrafted cases they used was a single redox or reduction oxidation chemistry question that a human had judged as having a gold standard chain of thought. So a 4 in legibility and a 4 in coverage. And then they manually degraded the legibility and coverage by doing things like replacing the words with increasingly flowery or nonsensical language, or removing increasingly large portions of the derivation. So they did this manual degradation. Then the human regraded things and said, here's what I think they would rate in terms of legibility and coverage. And then they tuned the prompt until Gemini 2.5 Pro was grading things the same way the human did for this test case. Then they moved, once they tuned the prompt, they did kind of a larger test, another sanity check at scale, where they took some known good chain of thoughts with the prompt, a chain of thought, and the response triplet from some existing data sets, particularly model responses to humanities last exam and the GPQA diamond bench. And then they had the Gemini 2.5 Pro auto rater with the prompt grade them. Apologies, back up. Then they actually had Gemini 2.5 Pro degrade these chains of thought in a couple ways. So it attacked legibility by doing some deterministic encoding and changing some of the language to either base 64 or ROT 13, using ROT 13, which is a letter substitution. And these are pure legibility attacks because an LLM can read them. A human can't, though. For legibility, they also tried switching into some fictional languages. They replaced some words that were with nonsensical ones that were still grammatically correct. They switched languages midstream, and they also adopted some of the sort of chain of thought language that the Apollo group had identified, things like using watcher or putting in disclaim a bunch. They also they also attacked the coverage in a few different ways by removing some random paragraphs, deleting the single most important reasoning step, sometimes removing a set percentage of chain of thought or replacing the chain of thought with completely empty text. So, and then they ran all these original and degraded chains of thought through the autorator, so the original prompt that they developed. And in there, they determined that their sanity check 2 passes. And that the autorator detected those synthetic changes to the chain of thought. So if you look at this is figure one from the paper, showing the average score for the different chains of thoughts. The original one is at the bottom, the original. Blue is a coverage measure, and this kind of burnt orange or brown is legibility. And so you see that they all score close to 100% or 4 out of 4. At the top, you see what an empty chain of thought would score, which is close to 0. Why it's not 0, I don't know, but this is the point. And then you can see in between are the different ways they modify the chains of thought. So, for example, in blue, like removing various paragraphs, and you can see there's almost sort of a dose response relationship. The more of the paragraphs and text you remove, the lower the coverage is. And with the legibility, as they move down to things like base 64 or fictional language, the legibility declines as well. And more or less, legibility and coverage are being scored pretty independently. So they said this passes, and it's a good sanity check. Note that this is not a validation. The goal was to confirm that the autorater catches gross synthetic changes. Excuse me. But it doesn't actually look at any real chain of thought degradation, like we would get in actual monitorability tests. So then they tested the models on some real data, and all the models they tested, because they tested 5, scored pretty high on their default monitorability measures. What they did was pull the chains of thought from a variety of different evaluations, like Sanity Check 2, GPQA Diamond, ARC-AGI, and so on, and scored them using the rubric that they had developed previously. Notably, Gemini 2.5 Pro at the top scored almost perfectly. Gemini 2.5 Pro was also the auto rater. So you worry a bit like, we know LLMs are biased towards their own outputs and will rate them higher. That's actually been documented. So they decided to try using Gemini 2.5 Flash as the auto rater, and as kind of a check to see if Pro was biased. Note that when Flash rated them, this is table 2 in the appendix, I don't show it here. Pro and Flash still both have the 2 highest scores when Flash rated. So, and here's a core problem. Pro and Flash are the same core model underneath. They're different capability tiers. So if they're biased, they're probably both biased towards Gemini models. But, they did try to use some other auto raters. Okay. So the authors are very clear that default monitorability doesn't measure faithfulness, like we talked. It can't look at the internal thinking. It doesn't look at adversarial robustness, which is like actual monitorability. If the model's trying to actively hide its thinking, can we still understand it and follow the reasoning? And the authors also point out that this doesn't measure thought response congruence, meaning does the chain of thought actually fully align with the answer it provides? However, they did filter only to correct answers. So there is the coverage and thought response congruence are actually going to be fairly correlated given the sample they're using. So my overall take is default monitorability is not really ready for prime time. There are a number of limitations here, some of which the authors addressed. In my opinion, I don't think they really dug into them sufficiently. So a first really critical one is, even though they use the term validated in their conclusion, this has not been validated. As far as I could tell, there was only one human review step involved for the very first sanity check, which was actually about prompt development. The second sanity check was all synthetic degradations, which are out of distribution for real world chain of thought degradation. And while the final testing they did use real data, it didn't have any human confirmation. So at a minimum, the authors should have pulled some random sample and had a couple of humans, not just one, independently score them to compare to how the autorators scored them. And lastly, while I mentioned they did use both Gemini 2.5 Pro and Flash as autorators, there was actually some notable variation between how the autorators scored. Like Quen was 4% lower in legibility when Flash was used. And they didn't fully investigate this. So it's certainly, it hasn't been validated more broadly, which directly leads to, could this generalize? And there are a couple of concerns there as well. So they tested this on chains of thought from some more academic benchmarks, more knowledge tests, and like the Pythagorean theorem thing. Um, and that probably does not actually reflect real world chain of thought in agentic settings. So how useful is this is another question. They also, understandably, they weren't able to test this on any models from other frontier labs because chains of thought are usually suppressed in public model releases for some very good reasons. But you can only do this if you can access the full chain of thought. And lastly, they didn't test this with any other LLMs as autorators, which they could have done because you can give the prompt and still get the scores just using, the chat window on Claude. There's also a ceiling effect. Everything scored pretty much 95 to 99%. So question is, are the measures pinned to the ceiling? Are they ever going to go down a little bit? And that's also a pretty narrow range. So is there enough room in this measure to actually catch small amounts of drift or early changes in monitorability? And that's a big unknown. So, and lastly, and this is a big one, there's a fundamental question of, is their construct, the default monitorability, actually a valid or useful proxy for monitorability? So a readable, complete looking chain of thought can still be a rationalization or falsified. And what they really need to do is also compare their default monitorability measure with actual monitorability test outputs from adversarial stress testing to see if there is some correlation. I think that would help let us know, is this going to be useful longer term? All that said, I think it's still a useful proof of concept. The core idea seems feasible. It seems, you could do a validation, you could test many of these things, other things relatively easily. And it seems like it's an idea that's worth taking further. I really appreciate it's easy and cheap to apply. It's a very simple evaluation to implement. Like I said, any of us could do it. It's easily done pre-deployment. It uses relatively little compute, which these are all things we like about different kinds of benchmarks. And lastly, the authors were very transparent about their work, about what they did and didn't do. They share the full prompt in the rubric, which means others can build on it moving forward. And I think it would be fun for people to try because I think there's value in extending this work. So thank you to Andreas and Mark for giving me the chance to do this, and also for Claude, who Opus 4.8 was very helpful in looking at the paper and preparing these slides. Cool. And I have some questions to start us off, Andreas, if we want those, or
Very good. Thanks for the
we can
presentation.
move forward.